6 hours ago, something happened above Mars that should not exist, and yet every instrument we trust insists that it does. At exactly 15:22 UTC on April 5, 2026, inside NASA's Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter Mission Control Center in Phoenix, a telemetry analyst sat performing a routine task she had repeated every single day for 8 years. There had never been a surprise, never an anomaly, never a single reading that challenged the laws of physics she relied on, until today. Her workflow was simple, methodical, almost mechanical. She reviewed atmospheric pressure data, compared temperature readings against baseline values, verified instrument calibration, and logged everything into the system. The Mars Climate Sounder, the instrument she depended on, was incredibly precise, capable of detecting even the smallest fluctuations in the thin Martian atmosphere. It was designed for reliability, not mystery. But as she processed the overnight data, the system flagged something impossible. A pressure reading appeared 6.1 millibars. That number, on its own, wasn't unusual. It's roughly the average surface pressure on Mars. But this reading wasn't coming from the surface. It was coming from 220 kilometers above the planet, in open space. She froze. At that altitude, the sensor should have recorded near zero pressure, essentially vacuum. Instead, it showed a stable, localized region with surface-level atmospheric pressure. It made no sense. She stopped everything and pulled the raw data directly from the archives. No processing filters, no system adjustments, just the pure signal. The number didn't change. 6.8 millibars. She checked the instrument diagnostics. Everything was functioning perfectly. She ran full calibration tests. Every parameter came back normal. There was no malfunction, no glitch, no error message to explain what she was seeing. So she did the only thing left to do. She called the mission director. Her voice was steady, but there was no hiding the disbelief behind her words. She reported the reading exactly as it appeared. Within minutes, the entire analysis team was assembled. Within an hour, another spacecraft confirmed it. Then another. And then, a ground-based observatory joined in. 3 completely independent systems all reported the same thing. A bubble of atmosphere floating in space above Mars. Not dispersing, not fading, not collapsing, holding steady at exactly the same pressure as the Martian surface, surrounded by the vacuum of space. And suddenly, the question wasn't whether the data was correct. The question was how something like this could exist at all. Because according to everything we know about physics, it can't. Gas doesn't behave this way. Without a container, it spreads out instantly, expanding in all directions until it disappears into nothing. Pressure only exists when something confines it. Remove that boundary, and the concept of pressure itself becomes meaningless. But this wasn't dispersing. It was contained, perfectly. A sphere, precisely measured, with a radius of 450 kilometers. Its edges were not chaotic or uneven. They were nearly flawless, deviating by less than 0.03 degrees from a perfect sphere. That level of precision doesn't happen naturally. It requires control. It requires energy. It requires intent. And the energy required to maintain something like this? Beyond anything humanity can produce. We're talking about terawatts of continuous power, comparable to the total energy consumption of Earth. And yet, no natural process could generate or sustain it in this way. This wasn't a natural phenomenon. It wasn't a comet. It wasn't outgassing. It wasn't anything we've ever observed before. It was something else entirely. And as the data kept coming in, one conclusion became impossible to ignore. This wasn't random. This was constructed. And if something had the ability to create and maintain an artificial atmosphere in the vacuum of space, then whatever we were looking at wasn't just advanced. It was deliberate. And that realization leads to a far more unsettling question. If this was built, then who or what built it? Because whatever the answer is, it changes everything we thought we knew about our place in the universe. And this is only the beginning. And once scientists accepted that this structure was not natural, the focus shifted completely from disbelief to analysis, and from analysis to intent. Because the deeper they examined the data, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a technological anomaly, it was a system. Every detail, from its position to its composition, pointed toward a level of planning that went far beyond a simple demonstration. The first major clue came from its location. This atmospheric sphere isn't randomly floating somewhere above Mars. It's positioned at exactly 220 kilometers above the surface, the precise altitude where the planet's thin atmosphere transitions into the vacuum of space. This is not an arbitrary height. It's a boundary, a dividing line between two completely different environments. And this structure sits directly on that line. It doesn't just exist in space. It connects space and atmosphere. It creates a bridge between them. That single detail changes everything. Because when you place a stable, breathable environment at the exact boundary between a planet and the vacuum, you're not just creating an isolated habitat, you're creating access, a controlled entry point, a transition zone where something can move between two worlds without being exposed to either extreme. In other words, this looks less like an experiment and more like infrastructure, and the engineering behind it supports that conclusion. The bubble remains perfectly stable despite constant external forces trying to tear it apart. The pressure inside is pushing outward, while the vacuum outside is pulling everything away. Under normal conditions, that imbalance would destroy any structure instantly. But here, nothing fluctuates, nothing collapses. The system holds steady, as if those forces are being actively countered in real time. That kind of stability requires continuous control. It requires energy, a lot of energy. Estimates from plasma physics models suggest that maintaining both the pressure and the magnetic containment field would require power levels reaching hundreds of terawatts. To put that into perspective, that's thousands of times greater than the total energy output of human civilization. No natural object generates that kind of power, which means whatever created this isn't just advanced, it operates on a completely different scale of capability. But even more revealing than the energy requirements is the precision. Every measurement, every reading, every scan points to something operating with exact control. The magnetic field doesn't fluctuate, the pressure doesn't vary, the composition doesn't drift. Everything is held in a state of near-perfect equilibrium. That level of consistency doesn't happen by accident. It's maintained. And when something is being maintained, it means it serves a function. So what is that function? One possibility is that this structure is designed as a gateway, a controlled passage between the surface of Mars and the vacuum of space. A place where vehicles, materials, or even life forms could transition safely between environments without the need for traditional landing systems or protective shielding. If that's true, then this isn't just about creating an atmosphere. It's about enabling movement. And that opens up an entirely new set of implications. Because if you can create stable environments like this anywhere in space, you're no longer limited by planetary surfaces. You're no longer restricted to natural conditions. You can build habitats, stations, or entire networks of infrastructure wherever you choose. You can reshape how space itself is used. And that raises a question that scientists are only beginning to confront. Is this a one-time event, or the first example of something much larger? Because if this object has the capability to construct one of these structures, there's no reason to assume it would stop at just one. The technology behind this isn't temporary. It's scalable, repeatable, expandable, which means this could be the beginning of a network a system of artificial environments positioned throughout the solar system, each one serving a specific purpose, each one connected in ways we don't yet understand. And if that's the case, then what we're witnessing above Mars isn't just a single construction project. It's phase one, the early stage of something far more ambitious. The data supports that idea in subtle but important ways. The bubble isn't drifting, it's holding position with extreme accuracy. It's aligned with orbital dynamics in a way that suggests active control, not passive motion. It behaves less like a natural object and more like a placed structure, something that was put there intentionally. And that brings us back to the question that now defines everything. Not what it is, not how it works, but why it's here. Because whatever the answer is, it has implications that go far beyond Mars. It speaks to intent, to planning, to a level of foresight that suggests this is only the beginning of a much larger operation. And if this is the beginning, then the next phase may already be underway. And if this really is the beginning of something larger, then the next step is no longer speculation, it's already written into the data we're seeing. Because once scientists stopped asking whether this structure could exist and started asking what it was designed to do, a much clearer picture began to emerge. Every layer of analysis pointed in the same direction. This wasn't an isolated event. It wasn't a temporary experiment. It was the early stage of a system being put into place with long-term purpose. The composition of the atmosphere inside the bubble is where that realization becomes unavoidable. This is not Martian air captured and contained. It is not a mixture formed through random chemical processes. Every element inside has been selected, balanced, and stabilized with extreme precision. The oxygen level is maintained at 21.3%, almost identical to Earth's. The nitrogen concentration supports that balance perfectly, acting as a stabilizing component for respiration. There are no contaminants, no dust, no particles from Mars's surface, no irregularities that would suggest natural origin. The air inside this structure is clean, controlled, and optimized for biological systems. That level of precision points to only one conclusion. This environment was engineered for life, not theoretical life, not unknown organisms adapted to extreme conditions. This is an atmosphere designed for organisms that require very specific conditions to survive, conditions that closely match those found on Earth. And that changes the entire context of what we're looking at. Because now, this isn't just a structure in space. It's a habitat, a fully functional, stable environment capable of supporting living systems, placed exactly where it can act as a bridge between a planet and space. That combination, location, composition, and stability suggests something far more complex than a demonstration of technology. It suggests preparation. And the energy systems supporting this structure reinforce that idea. Maintaining a magnetic containment field at 45,000 nanotesla with zero fluctuation requires an enormous and continuous power source. Theoretical models estimate that sustaining this level of stability would demand energy outputs in the range of hundreds of terawatts, far beyond anything humanity can produce or even store. This means the object responsible for this structure isn't just generating energy. It's managing it at a level of efficiency and control that we don't currently understand. And that brings us back to the sequence of anomalies. The deceleration event, the magnetic field activation, the controlled outgassing. Each step now looks less like a mystery and more like a process of deployment. A system being activated in stages, each phase unlocking the next. First, the object adjusts its position and velocity without visible propulsion, demonstrating control over motion. Then, it establishes a containment field, creating the framework for structure. Finally, it introduces the atmosphere, filling that structure with a controlled environment. That is not random behavior. That is construction. And if this is construction, then we have to consider what comes next. Because infrastructure is never built without purpose. The placement of this structure suggests it is meant to be used. It sits at the threshold between Mars and space, positioned perfectly for interaction with both. It could serve as a staging point, a transfer station, or even a long-term habitat. But there's another possibility, one that scientists are beginning to take seriously. This could be the first step in planetary engineering. Not just building isolated environments, but gradually altering the conditions of an entire world. If you can create stable atmospheric zones in space, you can expand them, connect them, scale them. Over time, you could extend that controlled environment closer to the surface, layer by layer, until the planet itself begins to change. In other words, this could be the earliest phase of terraforming. And if that's the case, then Mars is not just being observed, it's being prepared. Prepared for conditions that do not currently exist there, prepared for systems that require stability, pressure, and breathable air, prepared for presence. The implications of that are difficult to ignore. Because if something is preparing Mars, then it already has a plan for what Mars is going to become. And that raises a question that goes beyond science and into something much more fundamental. Who is this preparation for? Is this structure intended to support human exploration, providing a ready-made environment for future missions? Or is it designed for something else entirely, something that operates at a level of technology and capability far beyond our own? Because the scale of what we're seeing suggests this isn't about assisting humanity. It's about building something independent of us. Something that doesn't rely on our technology, our timelines, or our understanding. And if that's true, then this structure above Mars isn't just a tool. It's a signal, a clear indication that something is happening in our solar system that we are only just beginning to understand. And as more data comes in, one possibility becomes harder and harder to dismiss. This may not be the only structure of its kind, and if others exist, then this is no longer about Mars. It's about everything. And if this isn't the only structure of its kind, then what we're looking at above Mars may be just one piece of a system that extends far beyond a single planet. Because when scientists step back and analyze the full pattern, the anomalies, the precision, the energy requirements, the placement, one idea began to take shape. Not as speculation, but as a logical extension of the evidence. This isn't exploration, it's implementation. Everything about this object suggests it isn't here to observe or study, it's here to build. The level of control it demonstrates over motion, energy, and matter points to something operating with intent on a scale we don't yet fully comprehend. And when that level of capability is applied to a planetary environment, the result isn't a temporary experiment, it's transformation. This is where theoretical frameworks, once considered abstract, suddenly become relevant. Physicists have long discussed the idea of advanced civilizations classified by their ability to harness energy. A Type 1 civilization uses the energy of its home planet. Type 2 harnesses the energy of its star. And a Type 3 civilization operates on the scale of an entire galaxy. The energy required to create and maintain what we're seeing above Mars aligns far more closely with that third category than anything humanity has achieved. And that matters. Because a civilization operating at that level doesn't send probes just to collect data, it doesn't drift through star systems without purpose. It builds, it engineers. It reshapes environments to match its needs. And that is exactly what this object appears to be doing. The atmospheric bubble is not just a contained environment, it's proof of capability. It shows that breathable conditions can be created anywhere, independent of natural planetary systems. It demonstrates control over pressure, composition, and containment at a scale that removes the limitations we've always associated with space. And once those limitations are gone, the possibilities change completely. You don't need to find habitable planets. You make them. You don't adapt to environments. You redesign them, and suddenly, Mars is no longer a barren world struggling to hold on to a thin atmosphere. It becomes a candidate, a foundation, a place where controlled environments can be introduced, expanded, and eventually integrated, step by step, layer by layer, until the entire system changes. That idea may sound extreme, but the data supports it in a very direct way. The structure above Mars is not temporary. It is stable, maintained, and precisely positioned. It is not reacting to its environment, it is defining it. And that suggests continuity, a plan that extends beyond a single structure. Because if one atmospheric zone can be created and sustained, then multiple zones can exist. If multiple zones exist, they can be connected. And once they are connected, they form a network, a framework that could gradually reshape an entire planetary system. And here's where the implications expand even further. If this object has done this above Mars, there is no reason to assume Mars is the only target. Other planets, other moons, other locations across the solar system could be undergoing similar processes right now, beyond our current field of observation. Structures like this could already exist, undetected, positioned at key nikat where they serve a larger design. Which means what we're seeing might not be the beginning. It might be the first time we've noticed. And that realization introduces a new layer to the question we've been asking from the start. Not just what is this object doing, but how long has it been doing it? Because the level of precision and control we're observing doesn't appear experimental. There are no visible errors, no instability, no signs of trial and correction. Everything functions as if it has been done before, many times. And that points to experience, to a system that has already been tested, refined, and perfected somewhere else, which raises a possibility that is difficult to ignore. This isn't the first time something like this has been built. It's just the first time we've seen it happen. And if that's true, then the structure above Mars isn't just a project. It's part of a process that may already be underway across multiple locations, operating quietly, methodically, and with a level of patience that extends far beyond human timelines. And that brings us to the most important question of all. Not what this object is capable of, but what it's preparing for. Because everything we've seen so far, the energy, the engineering, the placement, the design, points toward one conclusion. This isn't random. This isn't temporary. This is preparation. And whatever comes next is likely already in motion. And if everything we've seen points to preparation, then the final question is no longer theoretical. It becomes immediate, unavoidable, and deeply personal to our place in the universe. What exactly is being prepared, and where do we fit into it? Because at this stage, the data is no longer ambiguous. Every layer of evidence converges toward a single, consistent conclusion. The object identified as 3E Atlas is not behaving like a natural body. It is not following the patterns of a comet, an asteroid, or any known interstellar object. It is operating with precision, control, and purpose. It is building, not observing, not drifting, not reacting, constructing. The artificial atmosphere above Mars proves that beyond any doubt. A stable, breathable environment in the vacuum of space, held in place by a perfectly sustained magnetic field, positioned exactly at the boundary between atmosphere and void. This is not a coincidence. It is infrastructure. And infrastructure is never created without intent. The structure functions as a threshold, a transition zone, a place where movement between two completely different environments becomes possible without exposure to either. It is, in every sense, a gateway, but a gateway is defined by its use. It exists so something can pass through it, and that brings us back to the question that has been building from the very beginning. Access for whom? If this were designed for human use, it would still represent technology far beyond our current capabilities. We are not equipped to create or maintain anything at this scale. We are not even close. And yet, the environment inside this structure matches human biological requirements with exact precision. That detail cannot be ignored, because it introduces two possibilities both equally significant. Either this structure was designed with an understanding of life forms like us, or we are coincidentally aligned with the requirements of something far more advanced. Both scenarios carry implications that extend far beyond Mars, because if the structure is intended to support life, then it is not just a tool, it is an invitation, a prepared environment waiting to be used, a system that enables presence, movement, and expansion in a place where none of that was previously possible. And if it is not intended for us, then it suggests something even more profound, that there are other forms of life, other civilizations, operating at a level where building entire atmospheric systems in space is routine, that what we are witnessing is not a singular event, but part of a larger framework, one that spans not just planets, but entire star systems, a framework where worlds are not discovered, they are engineered. The scale of that idea is difficult to process, but the evidence continues to support it. The energy requirements, the precision, the absence of error all point toward a system that is not constrained by the limitations we face. This is not experimental technology. This is applied capability. And that means whatever comes next is not uncertain. It is planned. The structure above Mars is stable. It is active. It is maintained. It is not fading or collapsing. It is waiting. Waiting for interaction. Waiting for activation. Waiting for the next phase. And that phase could take many forms. Expansion of the existing structure, deployment of additional nodes, integration with the Martian surface, or something else entirely, something we may not yet have the framework to even recognize. But one thing is clear. This is not the end of the process. It is the beginning. Because if one object can enter our solar system and begin constructing infrastructure at this level, then the idea that others may follow is no longer speculation. It becomes expectation. A system like this does not operate in isolation. It scales, it expands, it connects. And if it connects, then eventually it reaches us. Not necessarily in conflict, not necessarily in cooperation, but in presence. A presence that changes the definition of exploration, of civilization, and of what it means to exist within a shared cosmic environment. For the first time, humanity is not just looking outward into space and wondering what might be out there. We are looking at something that is already here, already working, already shaping the environment around us, and that realization forces a shift in perspective, because the future is no longer something we will discover. It is something that is arriving right now. Above Mars, a breathable atmosphere floats where none should exist. A gateway holds steady against the vacuum. A structure waits, silent and precise, defying everything we thought we understood about physics and possibility. The architects, whoever they are not hiding. They are building. And the only question left is how we choose to respond. If you want to follow this story as it unfolds and explore what this could mean for humanity's future, make sure you subscribe, stay with the channel, and be part of the conversation, because what happens next may redefine everything we know.